Welcome. This is the second lecture in our endocrine series. This is part 2, the traditional endocrine system. So we're going to start with an overview. The traditional endocrine system includes organs whose primary function is hormone release. So many organs secrete hormones, but the endocrine function is secondary to whatever their other function is. So for example, the heart. You're going to spend a whole lot of AMP2 just talking about the functions of the heart, and you probably won't talk at all about its endocrine function. But the heart does have an endocrine function. Kidneys, essential for urine production and blood pressure control and all sorts of other things, but it also has a major endocrine function. Adipose tissue, intestines, thymus, all these different components are part of the endocrine system, but they're not part of the traditional endocrine system because their primary function is one thing, and then they have a secondary endocrine function. So, brief summary of what the endocrine system can do. It affects our body and maintains homeostasis, which means pretty much everything your body needs to do, the endocrine system can affect. All right, so your metabolic rate, your immune system, your growth, water balance, everything that your endocrine system, that your body needs to do to maintain homeostasis is affected by the endocrine system. So we have the traditional organs of the endocrine system. So we start with the pineal gland and pituitary gland near the top. So if we look at the anterior side, this is the pituitary, which is considered the master endocrine organ, master regulator. On the posterior side, the brainstem, we have the pineal gland, which helps you regulate your sleep cycles. Then as we move inferiorly, we have the thyroid. We have the thymus, which is really has a major role in the immune system. And you'll talk about it a little bit when we talk about immune system in AMP2. So we're not really going to talk about the thymus. I know I mentioned it as an example of a non-traditional endocrine organ, so it depends on what source you're looking for the answer for that one. You have the adrenal glands. Talk about those right above the kidneys. Then you have the pancreas. The pancreas is really interesting. The pancreas secretes insulin and glucagon and somatostatin, so 3 major hormones. We'll talk about some of those a little bit later. But only 1% of the pancreas is devoted to endocrine function. 99% of the pancreas is devoted to digestive functions, which by our definition that we made on the previous slide, the pancreas shouldn't be considered part of the traditional endocrine system. However, the functions of the pancreas are considered to be so important for daily life that we consider it part of the traditional endocrine system, even though it doesn't fit our definition. If you've ever heard of the disease diabetes, you know the importance of the pancreas. That's when the diabetes occurs and the pancreas, something's going on that's affecting the pancreas. Diabetes is in the news like every other week, so you know that that's a very important disease worldwide, and the pancreas is a major player of that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Then in females, you have a uterus and ovaries, which are our important reproductive organs, but also play an essential role in the endocrine system. And the males, you have the testes, which produce testosterone, in addition to producing sperm for reproductive function. Oh, I missed one. The parathyroid gland. That is a gland that sits inside the thyroid gland and produces parathyroid hormone. And if you remember back from, I believe, Chapter 6 material, we talked about the skeletal system, parathyroid hormone is really important for controlling calcium levels. A lot of different major glands that we'll talk about. So when you're talking about the endocrine system, and you're talking about the traditional endocrine system specifically, you have to ask yourself 5 questions to really understand about how that hormone and that gland work. So the first is, what is the anatomy? Where is it located? How does it send and receive a signal? I mean, that's really important. How does it know to secrete the hormone? What controls that level of hormone secretion? So a lot of that is very important. Where is it located? Then what are the hormones that gland actually secretes? You don't want to study the pancreas if you're studying growth hormone, because the pancreas doesn't secrete growth hormone. You need to make sure you're at the right gland and you're studying the right hormone. Then what are the target tissues for that hormone? All right, so that's the third question. The fourth question is, how is the system regulated? These systems will have a lot of different regulations and ways to regulate, but they're all regulated by the negative feedback system. So the big picture is it's all negative feedback. And then what are the consequences of deregulation? So you have the overproduction of a hormone. That means you have too much of it. What happens? Is it bad? Is it good? We'll talk about that. When you have not enough of that hormone, right? And then you have the non-functional receptors. You could also include where the hormone's being produced, but it's not functional. So I would consider that if you have underproduction of the hormone or you produce a non-functional version of the hormone, I consider those the same thing. And then if the target cells aren't responding to the hormone, the receptor, something's wrong with the receptor. Those are really the only three things that can be dysregulated in the endocrine system, but it plays such an important role in human health. So we're going to start by talking about the hypothalamus. Yes, I know the hypothalamus is part of the nervous system, but it's also part of the endocrine system. And that's because the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland work in concert with each other to regulate pretty much everything in the body. The hypothalamus is the neuroendocrine axis. It's where the nervous system becomes the endocrine system and communicates with it. The hypothalamus has neurons that secrete two hormones. So it secretes hormones, but they're actually secreted, they're made by the hypothalamus, but they're secreted by the pituitary gland. We have two hormones that are made by the hypothalamus and secreted by the posterior pituitary. That's antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. Then we have 7 hormones that are secreted from the anterior pituitary. A lot of these hormones are called releasing hormones. That means they're going to stimulate the release of something else. A lot of these hormones are called inhibiting hormones. Guess what? They're going to inhibit the release of another hormone. So I know we have this very difficult concept to understand. You have a releasing hormone that stimulates the release of something, an inhibiting hormone that prevents the release of something or inhibits something. You know, those are difficult terms. I'm teasing you. They're named that because of what they do. So anytime you see RH, think it's stimulating the release of something. And anytime you see IH, think it's inhibiting the release of something. And we only see the abbreviation RH and IH when it comes from the pituitary. It's little hints for you on helping you memorize some of these hormones. So we'll start with the pituitary gland. Notice its anatomy. It's located in the center of the skull, right there connected to the hypothalamus. I've already talked about how the hypothalamus connects to the pituitary. But the pituitary is actually what releases those 9 hormones. All right, so the hormones of the pituitary. Remember, pituitary is the master gland. It regulates a lot of hormones. So we'll start with the posterior pituitary. It releases 2 major hormones. Again, these are made by the hypothalamus and then secreted into the blood from the posterior pituitary. Antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. So antidiuretic hormone, which primarily acts on the kidney to prevent the removal of too much fluid from the body. So a diuretic is when you remove fluid from the body. So they'll give people who want to lose weight, they'll take diuretics. That makes them urinate more, which removes fluid. Antidiuretic hormone, you are beginning to become dehydrated. You stimulate that to prevent the kidney from making a lot of urine. And then you have oxytocin, which potent role in pregnancy and birth process, as well as stimulating the breast to produce milk after a baby has been delivered. Then we have the 7 hormones of the anterior pituitary. So we have adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which is stimulated and caused by the hypothalamus, causes a releasing hormone to stimulate the ACTH to be released. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll talk in depth about growth hormone, GH. Then we have MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone. We have TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which we'll talk about quite a bit a little bit later when we talk about the thyroid. Then we have our gonadotropins. So these are the hormones that stimulate the reproductive system. And then you have prolactin, which again helps as part of the reproductive system, stimulates milk production after birth. So these are the major hormones that are part from the pituitary. We're going to talk about some of those in depth in the next couple slides. So here is the overview. So we have the releasing hormones, which come from the hypothalamus, or inhibiting hormones, which come from the hypothalamus. So if you have a releasing hormone or inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus, and it's going to stimulate the pituitary to release its various hormones. Then you have all these different hormones. You have 9 different hormones. You do need to know all 9 of them, and you need to know whether they're from the anterior or posterior, and you need to know their target cells. So the adrenal glands for acetyl-TH, the kidneys for ADH, growth hormone. Well, that's pretty much liver and everywhere else in the body. We'll talk about thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the thyroid gland. We'll talk about that when we talk about the thyroid gland. Prolactin, again, mammary glands, FSH and LH, those are part of the reproductive system or stimulate the reproductive system. So we'll talk about some of these in a little bit more depth, but you do need to know all 9 hormones that are secreted from the pituitary and their major tissue of action, and if they have a releasing or inhibiting hormone that controls them. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. We'll talk a lot about thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, when we talk about the thyroid, and we'll talk about growth hormone in depth. So you'll talk about growth hormone inhibiting and growth hormone releasing hormone. So, for example, we have ADH, antidiuretic hormone. It is made by the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary. All right, so the pituitary stores it, and then it targets the kidney, sweat gland, circulatory system to help with water balance. Then you have oxytocin, which is released, again, made by the hypothalamus, released by the posterior pituitary, targets the female reproductive system, and one of its biggest functions is to control uterine contractions during childbirth. And then here is our overview of the anterior pituitary and the target systems. Again, we'll talk about some of these in more depth. Right now, the ones that we talk about in more depth later, you should know their abbreviations and their name, how they're controlled, releasing hormones or inhibiting hormone, and the name of the hormone, what the target tissue is, and then its general effect. That's the main thing you need to know for the pituitary. But now we're going to talk about some of the specific ones. We'll talk about the thyroid. We talk about the thyroid gland. We'll talk about it. But I want to talk about the growth hormone because the best way to explain how the pituitary and the hypothalamus work to regulate and how when it's dysregulated, homeostasis is disrupted. So the hypothalamus releases growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which then stimulates the pituitary to make growth hormone. If you have too much growth hormone, you continue to grow and become ginormous. If you have too little, you become short of stature. If you have just the right amount, you become the average size. And so we say this is the right amount. That's sort of the slide that I got this from. Basically, growth hormone is what controls what size you are, how big you are. The less growth hormone you have when you're developing, the shorter you'll be. The more you have when you're developing, the taller you'll be. Our bodies want to control that. And as long as it works right, you'll have somebody in the average sized range. Somewhere between 5'6" and 6'2" or something like that. When it gets dysregulated, you can have people that get slightly taller because they have a little bit more growth hormone. Or you can actually get clinical conditions called giantism, where people grow so much that they are excessive in size that induces other medical issues. Or pituitary dwarfism, which means they don't meet what they call the minimum range of stature, or they can be related to health issues. I just want to point out in the United States, almost nobody is what we call pituitary dwarfism, suffers from pituitary dwarfism. That is the clinical term, because we can treat pituitary dwarfism with the supplementation of exogenous or drug like growth hormone. So any of the people who are what we call little people or little persons, that's the politically correct term as of today. In the United States, almost none of them will suffer from what we call pituitary dwarfism, which is the clinical term for somebody who is short in stature due to the lack of growth hormone. So how is growth hormone regulated? We have the hypothalamus, which senses the amount of growth hormone that's circulating in the body. If there is not enough, the hypothalamus releases growth hormone releasing hormone, which then stimulates the release of growth hormone from the pituitary. That growth hormone is going to cause all sorts of different effects in the adipose tissue, in muscles, bones, and then it's also going to stimulate the liver. The liver releases insulin-like growth factor 1, and along with other things, which further stimulates growth. But it goes back to the hypothalamus as it's circulating. So not only does it stimulate growth, it actually tells the hypothalamus that we have lots of growth hormone right now. So the IGF-1 tells the hypothalamus to not only stop releasing growth hormone, releasing hormone, but also it induces the reduces the release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So I know it can be a little bit complicated, but if you just think about it and break it down, so when growth hormone is low, we're going to cause its release to increase growth hormone levels. When growth hormone is high, we want to inhibit more growth hormone from being released. So that's all it's doing. It's regulating the level of growth hormone. So what happens with growth hormone is dysregulated. So we have a great example of Andre the Giant. He was 7 foot 4 inches. So if we look at this guy on the right, I can't remember his name, but he is 6'4". And you can see he looks almost miniature compared to Andre the Giant. Andre the Giant is not only taller, he's wider in stature, and they called him the Giant because he was a giant in stature, 7 foot 4 inches. He had excessive growth hormone while he was developing, which gave him the tall stature. However, he also had excessive growth hormone after his bones stopped growing. The growth plate sealed. And we can see that the nose, the chin, the forehead, even the cartilage in the rib cage, and internally you would have the heart and the fat cells and other things continue to get stimulated with the excessive growth hormone. And that's a second disease called acromegaly. Andre the Giant I think he was active until he was about 30 some years of age, 30, 40, somewhere in that range. And then he retired, and he basically, from what I understand, was a recluse, but had very difficulty walking and moving in his 40s and 50s, and died in his early 60s due to heart complications a couple of years ago. So this excessive growth hormone can make you very tall, and which a lot of people will think was a good thing, but there are a lot of negative cardiovascular side effects of having too much growth hormone being stimulated. On the flip side, not enough growth hormone, you don't stimulate the body to grow, and we call that pituitary dwarfism. So this little person here, there with her classmates, she's not a younger sister, she's the same age as those kids, and she does not have normal growth hormone levels. And so she's suffering from a disease called pituitary dwarfism. In the United States, this is very, very rare because we can treat it with supplemental growth hormone. All right, so we've covered a lot of material here. So I have some test questions you should be able to go back over. And just like always, rewatch the video if you can't answer these test questions. write them down, and then rewatch the video and try to answer them. And if you can't answer these test questions after rewatching the video, please send me an email. I'll be more than happy to help guide you. Usually I won't give you the answers, but I'll help guide you to getting the right answer. Thank you for your time.